Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person and online. My name is Anushka. I run the conferences and the events here at the Society of Antiquaries, and it's a genuine pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Laurie Johnson to you today. Laurie is Professor of English and Cultural Studies at the University of Southern Queensland. He is also currently visiting International Fellow at the University of Southampton. He's a fellow of both the Society of Antiquaries of London here and the Royal Historical Society. He is academic advisor to the Museum of Shakespeare in Shoreditch, a research dramaturg for the Oxford Marlowe Project, where we're colleagues, and a contributor to the Weather Extremes in England's Little Ice Age 1500 to 1700 database. His most recent major book has been Leicester's Men and Their Plays, an early Elizabethan playing company and its legacy, published in 2023, and he has published 4 other books, 2 edited books, and more than 60 book chapters and journal articles in related areas. Laurie was elected a Fellow of the Society here in May 2023, and this is his inaugural lecture here. I also want to say from a personal perspective, Laurie's research is extraordinary in how it's transforming our understanding of early modern drama and early modern spaces, of playing spaces, and I'm really glad that we get to hear that today. But also, he is one of the most extraordinarily supportive academics, particularly of early career researchers. So it is wonderful to be able to hand over to him. So please join me in welcoming Professor Laurie Johnson.
Thank you, and thank you for being here and online. I'd like to begin by thanking the Society of Antiquaries for having me on the program of the Tuesday lunchtime lectures. Coming from Australia, I do not make the trip to London very often or for very long. So I'm grateful to Anushka Lester for finding me this time slot during my short stay this year. I wish to extend my thanks to the Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities for accepting me as a visiting international fellow and covering some of my travel costs, and to my home institution for granting me research leave to extend my investigations into Guildhall playhouses while in the UK. Circling back to the Antiquaries, I will also extend my thanks to the Research Committee for their support of this program, and in particular to Edward Pritchett for expertly handling the AV in the venue. It's actually been over 2 years, as Anushka said, since I was elected to the Fellowship of the Society, and not a day goes by that I don't pinch myself about the absurdity of this fact, that this bookish kid from Goodna, Australia might grow up to gain election to one of the learned societies established more than 300 years earlier on the other side of the planet. To now be stood here at Burlington House, poised to speak on the history of early English drama, is nothing short of surreal to me. If the recording of this fails, in fact, I may struggle later to believe it. As they say on social media, pics or it didn't happen. My apologies, though, if this beginning seemed rather mawkish, but I'm going to claim that these opening comments are not merely perfunctory. Buried amongst my opening words are 2 key refrains that I will now use to frame what follows. Today's lunchtime lecture will be brought to you by the word absurd and by the phrase pics or it didn't happen. What do I mean by this? Good question. Let's start with absurdity. For those of you who have read the description of the talk, the topic may seem rather silly. What is all this guff about flipping the meaning of in and out? Well, I would like to offer a reassurance at the outset that I'm not going to suggest that modern speakers have got it all wrong and that at some distant bucolic time, in meant out and out meant in. That's not going to happen. I will, however, be presenting an argument grounded in a claim that may sound equally absurd. I will argue here that histories of the Elizabethan stage make a fundamental error by focusing too much on the Elizabethan stage. You heard that right, but bear with me, please. My point is that these 2 words are not sufficiently adequate to cover the long development of early English drama and the business of playing. To be clear, historians of the Elizabethan stage have, I suggest, for more than 200 years, been viewing the Elizabethan theatre with a somewhat golden age perspective that compels them to section off the Elizabethan from the pre-Elizabethan period, but often also to unquestioningly fold the theatre of the Stuart era into the same category. E.K. Chambers devoted the first volume of his 4-volume work, The Elizabethan Stage, to a study of the Elizabethan court and regulations of the stage under Elizabeth as the main factors shaping theatre in this golden age that saw Shakespeare emerge as one of the greatest figures of English literature. For Chambers, ultimately, the Elizabethan in Elizabethan stage is more than simply a period designation. It is a way to define the theatre of this era as a direct result of the desires of the monarch and her court. We have the Elizabethan stage because Elizabeth wanted it. The upshot of this is that most of our narratives of the rise of English drama have been focused on this idea of a sudden seismic shift that transformed playing from provincial annual morality plays and wandering players and minstrels to a well-regulated professional industry concentrated most heavily at royal court and in the London playhouses. The same logic is at work in the separation of the medieval stage, for example, the first book that Chambers published, from the Elizabethan stage, with studies of the latter rarely giving any attention to the former, except on occasion to say, unlike medieval drama, to explain that the former was largely irrelevant to the study of the latter. I suggest that a similar kind of tunnel vision applies to the uses of stage as a general designation for theatre as a whole. And this could thus be an issue with the many works published, like Chambers, on the medieval stage. To some extent, stage means what it means to theatre historians because it separates their specialist field from the subject of English literature, to which many theatre historians also belong. The neat formulation of page and stage can often be found in books and essays with the first term set up as the focus of literary critics or book historians, and the latter being the domain of theatre history. Now, I'll spare you a convoluted history of the debates that accrue around this distinction, but suffice it for me to say here that there have been times when scholars on both sides of this divide have insisted that Shakespeare had little or nothing to do with the other. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, for example, claimed that Shakespeare was primarily a writer whose words must be read, quote, in the closet, rather than being sullied with the vulgarities of the stage. Conversely, we find in some performance-oriented scholarship the opposite claim, as in Ralph Allen Cohen's list of 7 deadly preconceptions of Shakespeare teaching, in which the first is the claim that Shakespeare was a poet. Cohen dismantles this by arguing that Shakespeare was a playwright and that the poet claim was a construction of the Romantics like Coleridge. Now, I'll say here for the record that I personally believe both these positions have some truth in them, but that neither has the whole of the truth in them. I mention these debates about whether Shakespeare wrote primarily for the page or for the stage to simply point out that they tend to frame the way we conduct our research and present our arguments about the plays. For theatre historians working primarily in English literature, let's be honest, our work must ultimately always come back to the plays, and often of this fellow Shakespeare. Describing the plays from a theatre perspective means focusing attention on the space in which the plays were performed. Andrew Gurr and Mariko Ichikawa argue in Staging in Shakespeare's Theatres that the shape, orientation, exits and entrances of the stages of Shakespeare's era were relatively consistent in their adherence to principles that defined the rear of the stage, or front scene, as the locus, the position of authority, and the section near the public as the platea. To ground their arguments, Gurr and Ichikawa present visual evidence, including the Johannes de Witt sketch of the Swan Theatre, or that is, more accurately, the copy made by de Witt's friend Arnout van Boekel, dated 1596, and as they claim, Inigo Jones's ground plan for the design of an indoor playhouse circa 1616, and they also refer, without replicating, to illustrations of private stages from the title pages of the plays Roxana and Messalina in 1632 and 1640, respectively. So this is the part where I come back to the phrase, "Pix or it didn't happen." I have no issue with their limited supply of visual evidence, but I do think there is a heuristic error in making conclusions about the consistency of staging principles based on similarities between a very small sample. I also do not wish to claim that Gur and Ichikawa are alone in making this error. Rather, "Pix or it didn't happen," there is a natural tendency to draw inferences from visual evidence that favours points of similarity. The extraction of knowledge from evidence inclines naturally towards patterns and frequency. There have almost been no new finds in terms of original visual sources that might give scholars cause to disrupt the conclusions they draw on the basis of pictorial evidence. When Joseph Quincy Adams published his book on Shakespearean playhouses in 1917, with chapters on 18 playhouses, theatres and halls, and with 2 other chapters on innyards and a miscellaneous selection of other known playing spaces, 46 illustrations were included, but only 2 were original pictorial representations of the stages of the era. One, of course, was this De Witt Van Boekel sketch of the Swan, and the other was another Jones drawing, the floor plan for the cockpit at Whitehall, undated. The second Jones design, to which Gur and Ichikawa refer, was not known to scholars in 1917, since it was identified among the same set of papers as this one 43 years later at Worcester College. As it turns out, the belief that the indoor playhouse image is by Jones, or that it dates from 1616, has been significantly challenged twice. The first challenge was mounted in 1989, 11 years before Gur and Ichikawa published their book, as it happens, by Gordon Higgett and John Harris, who argued in their book on the complete architectural drawings of Inigo Jones that this image was drawn around 1638, and by John Webb. And in 2005, Higgett pushed the likely date of the item still further, out to around 1660, a restoration design. To complicate matters even more, Higgett and others have since also argued fairly conclusively that the cockpit image is also by Webb, not Jones, and it too most likely dates from around 1660. So one of the issues with relying on pictorial evidence, is thus that the number of reliable images may seem even smaller than first supposed. Difficult to cling to this premise, "Pix or it didn't matter," if the pics themselves didn't actually happen either, or at least not at the time and place that you believe they did. And if these images cease to be reliable, the notion that they provide a stable point of reference for consistent applications of the principles of staging also breaks down. Importantly, the provenance of the De Witt Van Boekel drawing is generally unchallenged, but it too becomes a problem for Gur and Ichikawa's claims, since they actually argue that it is the least reliable of the images from which they extrapolate these staging principles. If we look again at the Swan sketch, you will see that there are no curtains and there are 2 doors at the back of the stage, whereas they conclude from the other images that stages routinely were built with 3 or more doors and with a curtain, which is untenable if these other images, of course, are less reliable than the De Witt Van Boekel. So let me back it up now and revisit the absurd claim that histories of the Elizabethan stage focus too heavily on the Elizabethan period and on the stage as a visual focus. What's the alternative? My suggestion is that we might more fully embrace the idea that there was an awful lot of evidence for the design of stages based on what happened on them, but without relying on visual evidence. I'm not by any means the first to claim that the plays themselves tell us about the spaces within which they were performed. To to be completely fair to Gurr and Ichikawa, their book, in fact, also develops maps of stage movement based on the spatial language present in stage directions and in the ways characters describe directionality and movement. But my sense is that we might miss a trick if we, sorry, I missed a very important shout out here. Many of you in the room and those of you online have also contributed great work of this kind, using the plays to tell us about the shapes of stages. But my sense is that we might all miss a trick if we retrofit all of this language onto a relatively static understanding of the stage. Allow me to now demonstrate how this might be of benefit to theatre historians if we focus on even the most seemingly simple form of spatial language. The words in and out. According to the Dictionary of Stage Directions in English Drama by Alan Desson and Leslie Thompson, these words are of course remarkably common in stage directions in English plays, but they add the use of either word to mean entry or exit is dependent upon at least one other word. For out, they write. Widely used, roughly 550 examples in many locutions, most revealingly in the movement of figures and objects onto and off the stage, as with the comparable use of in. Out can signal either an entrance or an exit, with the key being the verb used rather than any firm equivalent to today's sense of on stage and off stage. To go out is to exit, but to come out is to enter. Okay, so perhaps the language of in and out is not so simple after all, at least not when applied to the language of the early modern stage. But I think we can clear up the confusion quite easily in relation to their description. However, if we note that the verbs to go and to come are what do the heavy lifting in directional language in these examples. If we apply the same statement to the word in, we see that in and out become perfectly interchangeable if the words go or come are attached first. To go in is to exit, but to come in is to enter. But to get a clearer sense of whether in or out did possess an otherwise stable sense of direction for the stage, it's worth checking instead to see how they operate when paired with a verb that is not, on its own, a directional modifier. One of the examples provided by Desson and Thompson is the verb to march. In Thomas Heywood's The Brazen Age from 1611, there is a stage direction for characters to march in when they are to enter the stage, and then marcheth off to exit. Enter Deianira and Lycus, to her Hercules, received with joy after the presentment of some of his labours. To them march in all of the Argonauts, Jason, Telamon, Atreus, Castor, Pollux, Theseus, etc. Jason persuades Hercules to the adventure. He leaves Deianira and marcheth off with the Argonauts. Since in is here established as being the opposite of off rather than out, it is very clear that in means to enter the stage. Curiously, though, the same play features a stage direction for a character to exit thus. Hercules shoots and goes in. Enter Nessus with an arrow through him and Deianira. Where march in served as an instruction to enter, goes in signalled a character's exit. It's worth examining this instance, though. Why does Heywood use the overriding goes to reverse the meaning of in only a short time after march in had established in for entry to the stage? To posit an answer, we should look at the staging and speech that surrounds this stage direction. The centaur Nessus has moments before this carried Deianira off the stage with a declaration of his intention to rape her as revenge for the death of the other centaurs, and he considers himself safe to do so without intervention from Hercules because they are separated by a mighty torrent, the Ioannis flood, could be Evanus flood. The direction for Hercules to shoot and then go in is coupled directly to Nessus entering with an arrow through him. Now, I read this as a moment in which Heywood is experimenting with an immediate form of what Tim Fitzpatrick calls the wipe and reset mechanism. Fitzpatrick's work on the inner and outer logic of Tudor staging is something I'll explain in more detail in a short moment, but for now I refer only to his description of the process that all theatre must employ for audiences to accept that one scene can be in one location and that the mere action of all the characters leaving a stage will signal a change in location represented by the space of the stage. Most commonly, wipe and reset is required to signal a significant change in location, but with Hercules shooting Nessus in The Brazen Age, the reset involves the entering characters being in the very same location towards which Hercules shot his arrow and then went in. The change of scene thus involves simply the flipping of the stage to move the action from the place where the arrow was fired to the place where it struck Nessus. By doing this, Heywood negates the need to stage the crossing of the floodwaters, which takes place in the interval between Hercules exiting and then re-entering. But one way to interpret this experiment by Heywood is to say that when Hercules goes in, he is thematically going into the space that is occupied immediately thereupon by Nessus and Deianira on the stage. Now, with this idea that in or out are not merely functional terms, directional terms, but might also be used thematically, we get to where Fitzpatrick's main claims could be helpful. Unlike Go Nishikawa, he argues that nearly all entrances and exits in early modern drama require a two-door logic, where one direction is thematically coded as further in and the other as further out, where in codes safety, domesticity, community, positive connotations, and out is coded as their negative counterpoint. According to this thematic argument, an exit could be coded as either in or out, depending on its meaningful relation to the space that is represented by the stage in that scene. Since this system would become unwieldy with the addition of a third door, Fitzpatrick's argument is that a third door is not part of the system, and that later plays written for private theatres with three doors actually lead to confusion when we project their staging possibilities onto plays across the whole era. Although I'm on record defending Fitzpatrick's stance on two or three doors, I also feel it is possible to now flip this debate by suggesting that the two-door system could do with some tweaking. For one, I've actually written recently about Macbeth going beyond the Fitzpatrick reading. In particular, I claim that following the murder of Duncan, the Macbeths are unlikely to go back through the indoor when they go to the bedchamber, whereas Fitzpatrick argues that they would naturally go that direction. Instead, Macbeth has already stated he will go no more that way. So the play is enhanced then by them going into their bedchamber by actually exiting in the outdoor. A moment of disruption that then speaks to their loss of homeliness or belonging in their own home. Furthermore, the use of the trapdoor is referenced explicitly by Macbeth. He says, "What noise is that?" as the apparitions start to appear, suggesting that the availability of a third space might need to be entertained even without a central main door off stage. I'm referring to the idea that the noise is not the cacophony of the spirits, as some people have suggested, but quite literally the noise of a pulley and lever system to get the thing onto stage. Now, rather than rehearse my defense or even disregard of some of Fitzpatrick's arguments, I want to point out here that the very problem with which I framed this talk is once again casting its shadow over the paper. All of the scholars to whom I've referred in the last few minutes are focused only on plays and stage conditions in the era that begins with Elizabeth's reign. Desson and Thompson's work is based on the period from 1580 to 1642, and the earliest play to which they refer in the entry for in is Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy of 1587. For out, they start with Robert Wilson's The Cobbler's Prophecy of 1590. Gur and Ishikawa are, of course, interested primarily in the work of Shakespeare, but also use pictorial examples of stages from 1596 onwards, of which two are now thought to be as late as 1660. And in Fitzpatrick's work, the earliest example of a two-door staging system is offered through a brief analysis of Nicholas Udall's Ralph Roister Doister, a play that was published in 1566, but is thought to have been first performed around 1553. Udall's play is therefore admittedly pre-Elizabethan, but Fitzpatrick makes a point of it being a terribly simple, even primitive, representation of the two-door system. He notes that for most of the play, one exit is represented as the door to the house of the widow Christian Custance. So all directions to go in or come out refer to going into or coming out of that house. To other directions to go out, though, he argues that the play merely removes characters to a non-place or an elsewhere space that is thematically away from the main action. Now, it hardly bears pointing out that Fitzpatrick's focus is also, like Gur and Ishikawa and Destin and Thompson, squarely on the stage and how directions instruct players to move across it, into it, or out of it. Now, I have a peculiar fondness for Udall's very simple, even primitive play, and I would like to recuperate it somewhat by arguing that it's not just a simplistic or primitive example of a system that characterises all early modern stagecraft. Instead, I think it represents a significant turning point in the long evolution of English drama that culminates in the Elizabethan stage. But to understand this, we need to first look to what performance spaces were like in the longer pre-Elizabethan or late medieval period. Importantly, for this step in the talk, I have shifted my language so that I'm not referring here to a stage space as such. I just said performance space a moment ago. First things first, pics, just to show that it did in fact happen. Here is arguably the only reliable image of the plan for the performance space of a play in the 15th century, from the manuscript of the Castle of Perseverance. And yes, I say Perseverance to keep the meter. Whether or not it had meter is debatable, but that's why I say Perseverance rather than Perseverance, which is dated to around 1440. But the manuscript copy is possibly from an earlier play that might date to as early as the turn of the century. The image is from the Macro manuscript, which also includes two other medieval morality plays, Mankind and Wisdom, and has been a staple of the many publications about medieval drama in the last 120 years. Surprisingly, there was for several decades significant disagreement about whether the image was in fact something that did literally exist or whether it was simply a representation of the fictional world of the play. Now, given that the image contains explicit instructions for where performers should stand relative to the sight lines of the audience, to me it beggars belief that some scholars could argue for a non-literal reading of this image. After all, here we have the instruction to construct a barrier to keep the audience from the place central to the performance. And here is the instruction to not have anybody sitting in the castle for letting of sight, for there shall be the best of all. It's in the second block of text down. Perhaps the problem for some scholars was that this did not look like any of the stages with which the earlier histories of theatre had made them familiar, so it must have been a work of fiction. I'll leave this here for a moment for you to distract yourselves, though, with bonus points if you can identify the bum joke in the descriptions. Now, even in the works that do read the picture as a literal plan for performance space, the terms stage and theatre began appearing routinely, extrapolating from the castle plan a consistent prescription for all medieval staging to be arena style, or what A.M. Nagler called, in 1976, a theatre in the round epidemic, in which, quote, everything was crammed then into the round, every platea was forced into a circular mould, end quote. Yet I'm not aware of any scholar who proposed that the reason a plan was necessary for Castle was because it was attempting to do something unusual for its time, rather than something usual. Notwithstanding archaeological evidence that earthwork arenas were used in some parts of the British Isles at various times in history, so the use of the central place was likely to have been perceived as relatively normal by both the audience and the performers, the scaffolds around the outside seem to be an unusual feature of this plan. In theatre history, we're well versed in how to read scaffolds in early modern documents related to the construction of playhouses or playing spaces. Erect a scaffold in a field and you have the makings of a stage, even a booth stage. Erect a series of scaffolds in a hall or inn-yard and you have seats for an audience. Yet the scaffolds here appear to function as a form of peripheral space for a specified character to speak to the action in the place. I think it's worth asking if this was a widespread practice. But if we also look to the spatial language used in the play of Castle of Perseverance, it becomes clear that in and out, while certainly used, do not refer to entries or exits from a stage to an outside space or the other way around. For much of the play, for example, the character of mankind has other characters battling over his soul and free will, seeking to call him out of the castle and into the world, represented by the circular space, where he is ushered then further onto each scaffold to be tempted or taunted by worldly and afterworldly sins. At one point, for example, Malus Angelus declares, "Now go we forth with anon, to the world us must gone, and bear thee manly erve among, when thou comest out or in," when you come out or in. In another scene, as Avaricia, or greed, is being beaten by Mundus, the world, he protests that he will call out mankind once more if it means the beating will stop. He first claims, "I skal do come out fra yon scoutis to your hende hall," in which he calls the castle a place of harlots or prostitutes, scoutis, and says he will call mankind out into this grand hall, hende hall, of the world. Avarice adds, "If you will no more beaten me, I skal do mankind come out free." Free here is a variant of fro, meaning forth, in which the directional language is one of coming out from within the castle and forth into the world. Now, I think it's significant here that in both examples of lines in which a character refers to mankind coming out from or into the castle, the word forth is also used. Go we forth and come out frey. I recommend that everybody read Martin Walsh's excellent reading of the spatial language of wagon top performances for York's Mystery Cycle plays, where the logic tends to be based on action taking place both amongst the audience gathered in the streets at each station and characters being called to go either up to the wagon or back down to the on-street level action. For example, the entry to the wagon is signalled in the Cain and Abel story by the command to "Come up, Sir Knave, the devil thee spied, ye will not come out, but yet be prayed." Welsh notes also that a command to go forth is used in place of the direction to go up onto the platform, as in the Purification play, where the description of the wagon as a temple on a hill is sufficient to cue language of elevation. But Mary is instead directed to go forth thus: "Lo, here is the temple on this hill, and Mary, go we thither forthy." Just going to say that again because I love saying it. Go we thither forthy. The same can be seen in the Passion sequence, where a dream scenario by the writer known as the York realist, that is, the dream of Pilate's wife. I nearly said Pilates' wife, just to let you know that's why I had to slip up there. The dream of Pilate's wife contains a line in which the beadle is beckoned by Pilate to step forth and stand up on height. Now, I wonder if the use of forth and free in Castle of Perseverance is tied to the same spatial logic, and that it refers as much to the movement onto the scaffolds situated outside the place as it does simply to coming out from the castle onto the place. In any case, it should be abundantly clear that none of the evidence of the spatial language in the cycle plays or in Castle relates to what we might now recognise as stage directions, but are instead conveyed through dialogue. The first play to provide a clear stage direction, including a directional instruction, is, I think, Mankind, one of the other plays from the Macro manuscript. In this play, there is one direction that contains the instruction, "Here Titivolus goth out with the spade." Since the action that follows features the principal devil Titivolus with said spade, it's evident that "goth out" is used here to mean enter. This play is also notable for being the earliest example we have of a play that explicitly engages with the audience to demand payment, as the dialogue includes lines in which new guys and nowadays, two allegorical characters, delay the arrival of Titivolus while they gather money from men in their midst, or else he will not be shown to them. They goad the attendees to pay more than pence or twopence, and think instead of royals, if ye will see his abominable presence. Now, it's reasonable to suppose that they portrayed the gathering of money in the fiction while also gathering money from the crowd in real life at this moment. What then can we make of a play text that uses "goth out" to refer to entering the performance space, since this is a coupling of terms that in Desson and Thompson's dictionary is used consistently to mean an exit from the stage? From a theatre history perspective, I think we're fortunate to have the gathering money sequence, not only because it tells us that this is something that the performers did in fact do during plays in the period. This sequence is also crucial because it tells us that the principal devil's abominable presence is unseen at the time that the money was gathered. If Mankind used a space that followed the plan of the Castle of Perseverance, Titivolus would have been already situated on a station or scaffold, presumably in full view, but even if concealed in some way, would be cued to enter the place differently, such as with the phrase "comes down." The language of staging in Mankind is remarkably sparse, but this one scene gives me reason to suggest that it may well have been written for Guildhall performance. The need for a well-prepared character, one worth paying money to see, to be concealed from an audience speaks to me of a performance space that could be accessed via an entrance leading directly to the stage, for want of a better word, for a performance space, from a room that was unable to be seen by people in any direction. The extensive scholarship on Mankind establishes a date of first performance in the 1460s and fixes its origins based on specific linguistic and topographical information in the text to either the Cambridge region or King's Lynn, Norfolk. As it happens, the recent archaeological work on St George's Guildhall in King's Lynn, led by Jonathan Clark, has revealed the 15th century floorboards and layout. Guildhall records show that there was playing in this space as early as 1445, and the storage space or buttery and pantry behind the hall would have been obvious locations for the kind of concealment space called for by the play, as can be seen on the reconstructed floor plan that Clark has generously permitted me to show here today. What I think we can see here is that even by comparing the language of in and out in two of the plays within the macro manuscripts, we can gain some insight into early signs of change in the way that space was being imagined in relation to performance during the first half of the 15th century. I'm mindful of time, so I'll move now fairly quickly through my current thinking on these matters. Mankind, I think, captures a moment when players are beginning to adapt to the spatial affordances of Guildhall spaces. But the use of out for an entrance shows evidence that a play is still using a spatial logic derived from a play like Castle. By the time we get to the early 16th century, we find significant evidence of plays that were written for performance in banqueting halls or similar spaces, where once again we can make an educated guess about the hall already having a buttery or pantry that the players can use as what we would later call a tiring space, which I suggest then becomes a catalyst for reversing the spatial logic. In plays like Henry Medwall's Nature and Fulgens and Luca, circa 1500 and 1516 respectively, which are widely associated with hall performance, players are directed to enter with cometh in and to exit with goeth out. Although it's worth pointing that all of the examples in these plays use come and go as the primary directional indicator. This is true also of John Rastell's The Nature of the Four Elements, which announces literally that it was written for hall performance in the prelude to the main song. Then the dancers without the hall sing this wise, and they within answer, or else they may say it for need. And the dancers are then ushered in with the final line of the interlude by humanity and ignorance. Come in then boldly among this presence, for here ye shall have good audience. My sense here is that these plays mark the transition to hall playing by literalizing the language of interior space. The direction to come in is literally a prompt to a performer who is in the concealment space, issued from within the hall. The direction to come in is not so much to enter a stage, but to enter the hall itself. Rastell's play contains a further indication of this literal understanding of space in lines that follow the song, cued with the last quotation. As the entertainers finish, discussions turn to what more entertainments can be provided next, and a character named Sensual Appetite responds, Now we will here begin to sing, for dance can we no more. For minstrels here be all lacking, to the tavern we will therefore. At which he exits singing, et exeunt cantando, etc. Rather than presume the dancers retreat back to the buttery, it's well worth imagining that they literally moved from the hall to a nearby tavern, through whichever exit in the building would accommodate egress, potentially moving through the audience in the process. Now, naturally, I'm only scratching at the surface of the range of plays available in this era, covering the transition from medieval moralities to the plays of the early modern period. But I've chosen several examples of plays widely already understood to have been written for hall performances to show that there was a time and a particular type of playing space that enabled the language of in and out to become relatively stable, because in a literal way. My final point, though, will be to return to Ralph Roister Doister, which you may recall was described by Fitzpatrick as a primitive example of a two-door system, because it relies solely on imagining one door as the passage into an offstage house, and the other door as a simple passage to any other unspecified place. Well, it's worth noting here that there is in fact only one reference in the play to this someplace else, and it's actually very specific. Mary Greek says, "But are you sure that your letter is well enough?" And Ralph says, "I wrote it myself." And Mary then says, "Then sing we to dinner." The stage direction then says, "Here they sing and go out singing." I mention this because, like the exit of the singers in Rastell's Four Elements, the "Sing we to dinner" could be read as a cue to exit not only through a door to some generic offstage space, but via the exit that leads naturally and normally to a dining space. While not entirely conclusive, I do note that Udall was a schoolmaster at the time he wrote this play, around 1552, 1553, and that at Westminster School, where he became dean in 1554, the old dormitory adjacent to the Dean's Yard was traditionally used as the chief performance space, and that College Hall, used for dining, was accessed by these stairs. The play's principal modern editor, Charles Whitworth, focuses on a potential royal performance for the debut of the play at Whitehall and describes the staging, using the word staging, as focused on a single door at the rear of a stage, like for Kristen Custance' house. But I'm inclined to want to still avoid the use of a language of a stage per se. Instead, I would like to suggest that the initial design of the play relies on this dormitory space without an established stage as such. Most importantly, when Udall decides to set up the one principal exit point as the doorway to an imaginary house, he also creates a possibility for reading in, not in the literal functional terms that had been adopted for hall plays of the previous decades, but as a result, ushering in the potential for thematic understandings that only later become the more complex Tudor logic employed by Fitzpatrick. These are, of course, still very preliminary thoughts in search of a pattern, I suppose, so I welcome further questions or comments that could help to avoid the appearance of stability and as absurd as that may sound. And of course, I welcome your picks. And at this point, I'll say, "Goth out."
Thank you so much, Laurie. Laurie's work is so inspiring as a model of taking those small details that people overlook and that evidence that people overlook and sort of gently, subtly questioning it. And the result is that you turn everything on its head and offer us new insights. So I'm really grateful to Laurie for sharing that new research with us and look forward to hearing questions. Housekeeping for questions to be heard online. We have a microphone which I will hand round to you. And if you're online, please do post any questions in the chat and my assistant, Dr. Evelyn Reedy, will read them out for us. So please, any questions?
Thank you very much indeed. I mean, it now forces us to rethink everything at this point. But given that these were plays and performed in public, have you tested your thoughts in reality on a space, whether I call it a stage or a theatre or a hall?
I haven't, thank you, tested them kind of thought experiment into actual experiment style. This is literally very new. So this talk was finished about a week ago. And at the time when I wrote the abstract, quite a significant time before that, it was a let's see how far I can push this kind of exercise. And I was just glad to find that there is some evidence that did sort of bear out a kind of transition rather than just that only one play was the example I was seeking of something earlier. But in terms of testing them out, that's for the future. Having said that, within the next week, I'm going to be doing a bit of performance space in some locations in York, in which we're going to try out a couple of plays from the early York cycles and from later plays by Marlowe and Shakespeare. And so the goal is to try and test out some of these ideas in those spaces as well by subterfuge, because I haven't forewarned my colleagues there that that's what I'll be doing. It's now on the record, of course, yes. But thank you for that question. Yeah.
I have a comment rather than a question. I'm a linguist and a Germanist, and what you've been describing is familiar to me purely linguistically because of the combination of a preposition, hin or her, and a verb.
Yep.
So forth, out, over, within, all of them depend on the starting point of the action. And to me, what you've been describing is linguistically what still exists very precisely indeed in German.
Thank you. I thought you were going to say the opposite, and then I was completely wrong. No, that's actually great to hear as well. I mean, I've done a little bit of linguistic training in the past myself, and that's why I was very, at least kind of keeping an eye out for those kinds of nuances without going them into detailed linguistic descriptions here. But certainly as this work fleshes out, that's something I want to work with. But it's always important that we do just not think of a word meaning the whole kind of universe of meanings that we want it to. Its position, its lexical context is so crucial. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie. That was amazing as ever. I have a question about the Castle of Perseverance. And one of the descriptions on the illustration that you showed us talking about the character of mankind coming out from under the bed. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit on that in terms of what's going on there, really.
Thank you. I'm also just trying to remember, was it mankind or soul who was under the bed? It was soul, yeah. Mankind instead is in and out of the castle, and he is on the bed, whereas soul sits in the bed for a very under the bed, sorry, for a very long time in the play until effectively the culmination, at which point the soul will rise. So it's like a stage trick that's designed to illustrate one kind of emergence of one aspect of his literally his soul. But that poor fellow sitting in that space for however long that play was going on, and it's not a short text. Hat tip to that guy. Incidentally, thank you for bringing it back to the Castle of Perseverance, because I do want to ask, did anyone spot the bum joke? What was it? Smoking bottom, yes. That the character had to be prepared to march forth with flames coming from hands and eyes and ears and his arse. Yes, that's why I had to put that in there. It's just, to me, you know, good old bum jokes that still 600 years ago, they're still doing them. Yep.
All right, we have our first question. Oh, and another one just came in, and then sorry, scrolling. Our first question online is from Matthew, who asks, where do the Cornish religious plays fit into this pattern?
At the moment, thank you for asking that question. I have to admit, when I mentioned archaeological evidence of arena-style plays, earth mounds, most of that evidence actually comes from the Cornish area. And that's as far as I'm prepared to push that at the moment. A lot more investigation would be needed in terms of what evidence we have of the text of those plays relative to this kind of language. And I must admit, I don't have the expertise to pull that off myself. That's going to be a team effort. Thank you for volunteering, Matthew.
And another question from Jennifer that I'm very glad Jennifer asked. She says, thank you, Laurie, for this wonderful paper. You mentioned how the hiding space for actors to be concealed could potentially be a buttery or a pantry. Does this imply that those performing these early texts for these early or maybe even early modern times may have been seen in some ways as hosting the celebrations or performing for some form of specific invited guest or guests? Could they be pretending to or actually providing the fare for the post-performance meal? I'm thinking perhaps about what we might infer about the individuals engaged in the acting itself.
Thank you for that question, Jennifer. In fact, it's a multi-layered, multi-part question. I'll just grab one initial bit that speaks to something that I was discussing with Heather Knight just before this talk, in fact, about wanting to rethink Guildhall spaces as not simply playing spaces, but to understand that they were first and foremost civic functional spaces, but that then the use of the Guildhall to get the players in was part of the kind of local identity that each location wanted to present, and that getting players of any ilk to present in those spaces was very much about trying to use them to become, in a sense, the proxy host for a celebration or feast of some kind. But also there's a lot of great work being done on guild halls as performance spaces in London, which I'd like to map out into understanding the use of guild halls around the provincial locations to get my head around the relationship between a space that is used most of the year round for other functions, but at given moments suddenly becomes this centerpiece for a performance of a dramatic presentation that is only fictionally entertaining, but is also the choice of play and the choice of spectacle is crucial to how those locations want to portray themselves to the people who have gathered and others who are paying their way.
Thanks so much, Laurie. That was absolutely fascinating. Something I'm interested in is the extent to which you are thinking about a variety of spaces with consistent facilities, let's say, for want of a better word, somewhere that you can be concealed and then kind of emerge from. And whether you're imagining plays that are kind of being written in such a way as to have certain things that they are expecting, how far you're thinking about the need to kind of adjust to a space that you go into. I'm thinking about traps, for example, which you wouldn't have at, say, Middle Temple Hall, but you would have in other spaces.
Yep, absolutely. The trapdoor continues to throw me a bit of a curveball. And there's some evidence that would suggest that there are trapdoors in some stage spaces or playing spaces, or at least that there is a way to construct a scaffold that will allow you to have a drop zone, so to speak, within. But the complexity of them at a various moment in history is still being debated, and I'm not sure 100% where I sit on that debate, but I do know there's a great essay by Todd Borlaug about aerial effects, where some people have said aerial effects don't become a thing in early modern playing until the Rose gets an above stage space built in which you can have pulley systems and so on built up in the roofing. Whereas Todd has demonstrated that absolutely aerial effects are written into plays dating back hundreds of years. And so it's not something that's only just the Rose did it because Henslow said so. But again, with the trapdoor, there's this question. A lot of work needs to be done to try and find out where are plays explicitly referring to an effect that would require a trapdoor and no other substitute would do. Or do we assume that if they're talking about going up and down, they're actually back on the scaffold, sorry, the wagon, and going up and down from the wagon, and the elevation is sort of more a case of up you climb now, rather than enjoy that little pulley system in the middle. But again, it's one of those open-ended things. We're still trying to find out more evidence, despite volumes and volumes and volumes being written about this stuff. We're still scratching at the surface, I think.
Another question from online coming to us from the YouTube live stream from Stephen, who says, thanks, Laurie. I wonder about whose perspective we might be witnessing in and out. For example, out from the book holder or in to the director or author, for example, Oodle?
Yeah, I just say Uddle because I'm used to that with my Australian accent. I'm not sure if it's more technically Udall. Please correct me, anyone who knows. Yeah, I must admit there was a little moment when I happily and with subterfuge flipped to describing when the phrase says to come forth or come out from a concealment space in a hall. I'm suggesting that there's a perspective of audience / director / person looking onto the performance space saying come forth from there, as opposed to the fourth on the old wagons, which is that's where the fourth is, where you must go to be the center of attention. And trying to think about when that could be a particular determining factor in whether the language shifts and the spatial understanding shifts. Again, still scratching the surface, but it's a great thing to continue to think through. Perspective is absolutely crucial. Not just who's being told what to do, the actor or performer, but from what perspective that direction comes. In other words, the person writing it, how do they perceive themselves relative to a staging event or a performance event? Are they the person directing it from the front, or are they somehow in the acting troupe saying, get out there now, pushing people onto the stage, so to speak? That's always a key component. And I have to admit there was a moment when I was thinking that was probably going to be the driving factor until I stumbled onto Ralph Roister Doister as possibly a good tipping point moment. At the moment, I'm still hanging on that one, but it's certainly not something that I'm going to never give up if more evidence drives another direction.
Thank you, Laurie, and thank you, everyone. That's all that we have time for, unfortunately, today, but I'm sure if anyone has questions, more questions, Laurie would be happy to stay around for a few minutes. The only remains for me to say that our next lunchtime lecture is in just a couple of weeks. On Tuesday, the 1st of July, we'll be hearing from Dr. Alan Brodie, and his talk is titled The English Seaside as World Heritage, You're Having a Laugh. So that's in 2 weeks on Tuesday. You may also like to know that our autumn-winter season of events is just being announced this week. You heard it here first. So do have a look at the website and see what we've got coming up in the next few months. And finally, just huge thank you again to Laurie for his inaugural Antiquaries lecture.